It's been a bad last few days for the Russian troops in Ukraine. There's been a sudden retaking of territories both in the south as well as in the east in what's being considered a blitzkrieg by the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine has retaken Izium and Kupiansk, both in Kharkiv, which happens to be the second largest city in Ukraine. The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says that more than 6,000 square kilometers have been retaken from Russia. As Russian forces withdraw in the face of these recent counteroffensives, the Kremlin has been repeating its claim that its military only invaded because of the threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine. Now, this has been a constant refrain from the Kremlin as well as military briefings that the Russian administration has had. It's been a recurring theme of Putin-era foreign policy that Russia has followed, that an expanding NATO is an existential threat to Russia. In fact, Western politicians and commentators, they generally dismiss this view. They view NATO as purely a defensive alliance which is made up of voluntary members. They see Moscow's position as a dishonest excuse for both the original invasion, which happened in February, and also the subsequent battlefield setbacks we've seen over the last 6 months. On Crux DeCode, why grasping Russia's geopolitical idea of itself as endangered by NATO is crucial to understanding why this present war happened, and more importantly, on how to map out a future path towards peace. Will this worldview from Moscow, whether it's right or wrong, only further push Russia to take more extreme measures, maybe even resort to nuclear weapons as it loses ground? Or will it actually temper down Vladimir Putin and perhaps maybe even lead him or force him to accept a defeat on the battlefield? Or if not a defeat, at least settle for a compromise. NATO was founded in 1949 with the primary objective of countering the perceived Soviet threat to the United States as well as to its European allies. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 presented a very unique opportunity to rethink security architecture in Europe. Both the Americans and the Europeans had declared that humanity stood upon the threshold of the end of history. They were all proclaiming a borderless world. What then was the need for such a Cold War relic like NATO? Well, how wrong they turned out to be. Vladimir Putin, again rightly or wrongly, believes that the George H.W. Bush administration had promised that NATO would not expand if the Soviet Union permitted the reunification of Germany. Bush rejected proposals for expanding the alliance, but subsequently, under Bush's successor, President Bill Clinton, it changed completely. All of these efforts by the hawks and the hawkish lobby, both within the US Congress and beyond, in the Beltway list of foreign policy experts as they were, it all eventually culminated in 1996 with the passing of what's called the NATO Enlargement Facilitation Act. It was passed by both the US Senate as well as the House of Representatives. So whether it was President Clinton, George W. Bush after him, or even Barack Obama, all of these administrations championed NATO's eastward creep. A first wave of expansion drew in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. This happened in 1999. Then, about half a decade later, in 2004, a second wave encompassing Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. This too opened up a new NATO front with Russia. Also remember, at around the same time, countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the Balkans were also incorporated into NATO. But a key moment happened in the 2008 Bucharest summit. In that summit, it was declared that NATO would welcome Ukraine and Georgia and their aspirations for NATO membership. They agreed that these countries will eventually become full-fledged members of NATO. That was a key moment for both Vladimir Putin and for Russia. It signaled to them unambiguously that NATO will never cease to expand, and right now was at the very doorstep of Russia. But there was a second and a far bigger reason as to why Putin chose to cynically exploit NATO's expansion plans. He found it a convenient distraction from the troubles he was facing at home. It was also a convenient tool to rally the Russian people around the flag, and more specifically, around him and his leadership. Putin has utterly failed in the 20 years that he's been in power. He's failed to build Russia into a modern-day economic model, an economic model that would actually be attractive to its neighbors and not repel them. Today, in fact, if you look at it, most of Russia's youngsters are making a beeline to flee the country. They want to go to the West, they want to go to America, they want to go to Western Europe. This is the very same idea that Putin has despised in the last 20 years. Now, to be very sure about this, post-Cold War Russia evolving into a liberal modern-day democracy, much like post-World War II Germany did or Japan did. Now, that was hardly a sure thing. There was no guarantee that such a thing would happen. Indeed, given Russia's scant experience with democracy, it was a long shot. But it was a long shot worth trying, because even a less than democratic Russia would have been better than what it is today. It would have been more attractive to its neighbors, not more menacing as it appears today. But across the last decade or so, as Russia's economy stagnated, Putin either had to go in for deeper economic reforms, which might have, of course, weakened his top-down control of the country, or he would have had to double down on his corrupt, crony capitalist kleptocracy. He chose the latter. Putin shifted the basis of his popularity from being the distributor of Russia's newfound wealth and an economic reformer. He became the defender of the motherland. Countries and leaders usually react to humiliation in one of two ways, either with more aggression or with introspection. For example, after China experienced what it called the century of humiliation from the West, it responded under Deng Xiaoping by essentially saying that we'll show you, which is the West, we'll show you by beating you at your own game. Now you contrast that with what Putin did, or how he responded when he felt humiliated by the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the expansion of NATO. He responded by saying, I'll show you, I'll beat up Ukraine. So that's exactly what's happened over the last 6 months or so. Today, we're in a situation where it's looking increasingly difficult, or rather even bleak, that this war will ever end, because Vladimir Putin, his entire existential threat, is losing on the battlefield. A strong man cannot survive after having lost a war. So the more he gets pushed by the Ukrainians as they are retaking territories both in the east and in the south, it will only push him further into a corner. It will only make him bring onto the table options which would have been considered absolutely incomprehensible, absolutely unimaginable when this war began. And that includes chemical weapons, that includes tactical nuclear weapons as well. The Ukrainian army is also not taking things lying low. It is indicated many times, particularly in the last month or so, that Crimea is very much on the table, that taking back Crimea is not such a long shot after all. In fact, earlier this summer, the Ukrainians had hit an airfield inside Crimea, very close to where the Russian tourists were holidaying. That, of course, led to an exodus of Russians leaving Crimea. It was the very first time that Ukraine showed its capability of hitting inside Russian-held Crimea. And also the first time it showed intent that it wants to put Crimea back on the table. There are also reports of Ukrainians firing deep inside Russian territory, sometimes up to 100 kilometers inside Russian territory. There are also chances that Ukrainian troops could even cross the border into Russia. Now, if that were to happen, then that could potentially trigger a nuclear response from Russia. And if a nuclear response happens, whether it's tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons of some form, then that would inevitably mean that NATO would have to step in, because it would be a violation of Article 5 of NATO's chapter. Article 5 says that any attack on a NATO member is an attack on the entire alliance. Even though Ukraine is not a full-fledged NATO member yet, this would mean that all bets are off. So surely a nuclear attack on Ukraine, even though it's not a full NATO member yet, will trigger an equal and powerful response by the 30-member military alliance. And like I said, that means that all bets are off. But that is not the only scenario. There's also an alternative set of outcomes that could play out. Alternatively, a Russian retreat from Ukraine could also embolden Ukraine. It would also unambiguously vindicate NATO and all the support it's given Ukraine over these last 6 months. It would also embolden NATO to keep supplying weapons in case of any new conflict without actually having to get involved, without actually having to commit its own boots on the ground. For the United States, this would be a big fillip right after its debacle in Afghanistan last year, where it fled even as the rampaging Taliban took over the country after 20 years of the war on terror. And let's not forget what a clear and present message this would send to China. The very same China which wouldn't hesitate to invade Taiwan, it will now sow the seeds of doubt about predicting outcomes of a military conflict. Even the mighty Russian army could not defeat tiny Ukraine. And that's not all. Already you're seeing newer conflicts happen in the Balkans, the latest being the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This could embolden newer countries to take NATO refuge and NATO's unending supply of weapons, which will only be a huge boon for American weapons companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. A lot is riding on Vladimir Putin and how his special military operation in Ukraine concludes.